Hello, okay, here I am. No more black screen. How's it going? Happy Friday. Friday the 14th. Jeez. Oh, happy puppy. Hi. You want the treato? Here you go. Here you go. Puppy appears. How you feeling, Lily? Did the doctor visit help things? Are you feeling any better? Doctor visits and rests. Today is much better. That's good. I'm happy to hear that. Why? This feels like it's way far over. Let's tilt it back a little. Puppy. Got itchy butt. You got an itchy butt. Oh, I'm a little sleepy today. My sleep schedule's all out of whack again. I gotta fix that. Getting to the point where I can't sleep until it's early in the morning again rather than falling asleep at night, so I need to go through my reset process for that, which is kind of a pain. Current hours of what? My sleeping? Is that what you mean? Because, yeah. I have this bad cycle thing where I don't know. I don't know if it's delayed sleep phase syndrome or what, but I mostly seem to want to sleep from like, I don't know, like 6 a.m. maybe. Right now I think I'm around 5 a.m. until sometime in the early afternoon. That's the way that my body wants to work, apparently. And occasionally I can put that to more normal person hours by just staying up all night and then all day and then sleeping, at like 9 a.m. the next night. And then that sometimes will keep me going at normal nighttime sleeping hours for a few weeks or something. Yeah, I had a good run recently. What did I say? Did I say 9 a.m.? I meant, yeah, fall asleep at 9 p.m. 9 p.m. But that's the only way I've found to be able to really get into nighttime sleeping is do that stay up all night and all day reset type thing. Because eventually, what will happen is, I'll be falling asleep at like 10 o'clock pretty regularly, but that'll slowly shift towards like 11 o'clock falling asleep, and then that'll shift towards like midnight, and then it'll jump to like I'm not falling asleep until 3 a.m. And then from there, it's not too long until I'm back to sleeping at like 5 a.m. The Sharkies have returned! Ha! Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, if I am just sleeping from 5 a.m. till like 2 p.m. or whatever, I sleep fine. I have normal amounts of energy when I am awake, kind of. But it's just not the hours that most people operate at, and it's awkward doing things. And once it gets later at night, it's like 10 o'clock at night, even though I'm awake and I'm going to be awake for hours still, it's hard to get things done that late. Especially, anything that might make any noise, but also just, I don't know, just doing normal stuff. Like I end up just watching YouTube videos or something, like, or I don't know, whatever. So I just end up feeling like I can't really accomplish anything, even though I am awake. So I prefer to be awake during daytime hours if possible because it just seems easier to actually accomplish things. And yeah, like Farmo says, nobody else is awake, so you can't do things that require people. Welcome back, Sharkies. I'm sorry you had to have an awkward school meeting thing that just didn't sound like a fun time for anybody. Hopefully, you feel like something actually got accomplished there. We're just talking about sleep stuff. Yeah, so we didn't actually do any reading on Wednesday, which is fine. It was okay to take a little break from the book, but we are on part 2, Cherek, on page 161, chapter 12. I think we have 100 pages left. 101 maybe. Armo says the start of this semester has been weird for everyone. Yeah, this feels like a weird... I think this is sort of a weird start of semester because it's like everyone was used to doing everything online, and then, and everything was all remote. And then stuff started going back to in person, and it's like, oh, and people, I think, quickly went back to being used to that, and then now it's sort of like, are we back to being remote? Is everything online again? Probably, but it seems sort of hesitant about that. Memo says delays, uncertainty, weirdness, yeah. So, I just had a pause of introspection there, I guess. Should probably continue saying words out loud. Where'd that puppy? I hear clicky nails on floors. I don't see the puppy. There he is. Oh, as soon as I looked away. Hi. Did I summon you? Am I hearing myself? I need to mute that. There we go. Look at that waggy tail. You got something in your eye? Kind of winking a little bit. Farmo says 2 of my classes are currently as they will normally be. They were already going to be online, but 2 of them are kind of like, we're not sure how things are going to go. Yeah. Look at his little nose between his paws. What a cutie. So how has everybody's week been? Went to see Dune yesterday, finally. We had an entire theater to ourselves, nobody else in it. It was really good. I quite enjoyed it. I have read the book a few times, though it's been quite a while since I've read it. I've read Dune, the original, like the first book I've read at least 2 times, maybe 3 times. So not like I haven't read it over and over and over and over and over, but I've read it a few times, and enough for, like it to be quite memorable. Farmos felt better having nobody else there. Yeah, it was fun. And yeah, I quite enjoyed the movie. I felt that it, unlike some other renditions of Dune, it captured what was important to the book, I think. It captured a lot of like what themes were important from the book. And there were some minor changes, but nothing that I think was in any way negative to change. Like, from, again, what I remember, it's been a long time since I've read it, but Definitely some of the stuff was exactly as I had pictured it myself. Not like absolutely everything, but a lot was like, oh yes, that's how I thought that would be. There were, of course, the movie was not 1-to-1 for the book, so there was some stuff missing, but I don't think there was anything vital or important missing. Some lines of dialogue, one or two scenes that I would have like that I remember. There was one bit that I kind of was waiting for, not because it's like a really important scene or anything, but it's just something that was memorable to me. Where when they are newly on Arrakis, um, the Atreides family has, I think, like a political dinner with some people, um, just some locals or something like that, or some, I don't know, plenipotentiaries. Um, and Paul has this bit where he describes nobles or something like that as being similar to like a drowning man, like a drowning sailor climbing atop, his friend's shoulders to try and get to the surface of the water, um, to stop from drowning, and or like how there have been cases of sailors that have drowned with boot marks on their shoulders because someone else tried to climb up on their shoulders to stop from drowning or something like that. And then the people that he's talking to are like, "What's drowning? What is that? What does this word mean, drowning?" I guess they just don't know the word, and so he has to explain that it's to be submerged underwater until dead, um, because these people just have no concept of the idea like of that being possible. um, the death process. Um, so yeah, I thought that struck me as an interesting thought in that book, an interesting moment in the book, and so that was something that, it's a small thing. It really isn't important that was missing, but that was something that after the movie I was like, oh, they didn't have that. Oh well. I did. Yes, the sound design was very good. The director of photography clearly had a field day with like the colors and things like that. Um, there was definitely a lot of the like color design. Lots of matching colors in different scenes, but then contrasting to different sort of color schemes in other scenes. Um, so that those both stood out. Definitely, um, very reminiscent of Blade Runner visually. And then, the director directed at least Blade Runner 2042. But yes, it was noticeable because, and I wasn't thinking about that while I was watching it, but I was thinking, hey, this looks like Blade Runner, especially the scale of some things. A lot of the like, massive ships and things like that, had a very Blade Runner look to them. And then afterwards, I was like, wait a second, wasn't this director involved in Blade Runner in some ways? Yeah, yeah, it was. So that kind of makes sense. But yeah, I enjoyed it, and I felt like it was true to the book, which is nice. It's always nice when that holds up that way. Um, Sharky's felt like it's the first sci-fi fantasy movie that felt like it was an actual real place. That's that's similar to something that Farmos and I were talking about, in that we were saying that this is less of the way it looked and more about the cultural stuff. But it felt like, and this is a lot to do with Frank Herbert's writing in the book that's translated to the movie. Um, but it felt like any sort of weird sci-fi cultural stuff that was happening, there was a reason for. It wasn't just thrown in like, hey, look at this wacky sci-fi thing, or look at this weird space culture. It was like, they have traditions here, and you can kind of you can extrapolate maybe why those traditions exist. You know, what the reasons for them are, why things are the way that they are. Um, and, you know, some of that translated to visual things, but a lot of it I thought was just sort of, it felt believable. And to an extent, you know, some of, like, things are well explained in the book, in Dune. And so some of the stuff in Dune, in the writing, feels believable. And I think that that's kind of linked to the movie. Um, Farmos had physio today and is recovering from that. Hmm. Have you watched The Mandalorian? Physio is mean sometimes. Because I quite enjoyed The Mandalorian as far as sci-fi goes. I think that The Mandalorian's done a really good job of, I don't know, being good Star Wars content. Um, we've been watching the Book of Boba Fett as it's been coming out. That's got new episodes every Wednesday right now. Lily liked Mandalorian. Yeah, yeah, the music was great. They did a great job of that. Um, but yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed The Mandalorian. We've been watching the Book of Boba Fett, and so far, that hasn't held up to me in the to the same extent with the writing necessarily. I don't know. Overall, it hasn't been as exciting for me. Like I haven't been as hyped for new episodes of the Book of Boba Fett. And the most recent episode, there was some wonkiness to it, some stuff that felt unnecessary. But then again, like The Mandalorian, I think maybe also took like a few episodes to find its footing. Sharkies are enjoying the Book of Boba Fett, but haven't felt as connected to it. Um, yeah, The Mandalorian maybe wasn't perfect right from the beginning, and I feel like, maybe it did take a little time to start getting better and better. So um, maybe Boba Fett will improve as it goes on as well. I know what bit you're talking about, Lily. I don't know how. It was one character, I think, as far as I'm aware. If I'm like, I don't know if I know the whole story, but it was one character who, yeah, had some pretty sketchy things to say, but also not like the most central character, not the most important to the plot. Was in a few episodes, but not every episode. Not so. And people got upset when that. Some people got upset when that person did not get recast, and there was this whole thing of, oh, they fired her for her political views, and it's like, well, no, they didn't rehire her. That's not exactly the same thing. But I don't think that had that much of an impact on The Mandalorian. They were winding up to put her in as a regular, but then pulled it from future stuff. Oh, yeah. Well, that's fine. I won't be upset if they recast that person. Um, Farmos thinks the solitary nature of Mando is easier to relate to than Boba Fett's political stuff. Maybe. I suppose it's a different side of things, and it's a different type of story to tell. that political writing, I don't know, I can't get that stuff right. It's, if I try to put that type of things into a D&D game, things like that, I'm not sure. It does kind of feel, now that I'm thinking about it, a little bit like a political setting D&D style game so far. At least some types of games that I've been involved with. A little bit of that feeling to it in Book of Boba Fett. Well, it's 7:20. Why don't we read? Why don't we get into into part 2, huh? We've got a map. Part 2 starts with a map of Cherek. Let me see if I can. There we go. That's a nice shot of that. So Drasnia to the east. Sea of the Winds to the west, and also the Gulf of Cherek to the southeast. I believe they said they were being summoned to Val Alorn, which is over here. I think that's where they said that the kings were meeting. So that is probably where we are headed to first. Trellheim down here. I believe Barak was revealed to be the Earl of Trellheim. Some very Norse-sounding names in here. Jarviksholm. Land of the Trolls. Alorn River. This is, I think, River Drasny up here. It's interesting looking at this map because there's some places here that I just, I'm out of focus. Back here. Thank you for focusing on the map. Now look back at me. Look at the map. Now look at me. There we go. Yeah. It's interesting looking at this map because, I've read these books a few times, and there are some places here that I think just never come up. That maybe never even get mentioned in the chapters at all, like in the books at all. Pulling a Tolkien in world building things that aren't necessarily vital to the story. I appreciate that too. It's kind of boring if you look at a map and you go, okay, these are the places on the map that have names, so those are places that are going to be important to the story. That's boring. That doesn't feel like a real world. It feels like someone wrote the story and then scribbled some lines down and tossed the names in places. Entire lore that doesn't come up. Yeah. I'm not going to say what or where to me, isn't familiar. Because, well, let's find that out together, huh? But let's do a little recap. Part 1, a lot of Part 1 was about Garion's childhood. And Garion meeting various people. Mr. Wolf, who has recently been revealed, Garion thought was just an old storyteller, but has recently been revealed to be someone much more important than just an old storyteller. Belgarath the Sorcerer, who is apparently over 7,000 years old, and Garion's supposed Aunt Pol has recently been referred to as Polgara the Sorceress, slightly younger than Belgarath. And if that weren't upsetting enough, she also kind of offhandedly referred to Garion as just being some boy that had been placed in her care recently. And I think that was pretty crushing to Garion, that perhaps she doesn't actually really care about him at all. And really that there's no familial connection there at all either. Um, he's feeling adrift. So yeah, Garion's childhood. We've got Barak being revealed as the Earl of Trellheim, not just some big scary warrior, and Silk being Prince Keldar of Drasnia. Not directly in line for the throne, just a cousin, I think, a royal cousin. Yes, right, a royal nephew, that's correct. His uncle, the king. I think out of everybody that Garion knows personally at this point, that is, traveling with him, the only one that is who he says he is up front is Dernick the Smith. Dernick and Garion himself. Farmos is talking about David after dentist. So I think Garion is a little rattled right now, especially because of Aunt Pole and Mr. Wolf. Especially because of Aunt Pole. But anyways, so they had a meeting with King Fulrak of Sendaria, who basically said they have to go off to Val Alorn because the Alorn kings are looking for them, and if they don't go, they'll just keep getting stopped by someone or other. So Mr. Wolf declared, well, we might as well get this over with. Let's go. And that's roughly where we're at. So why don't I get started, huh? Page 161 out of 262 pages. Part 2, Cherek, Chapter 12. In the grey first light of early morning, they rode through the quiet streets of Sendar to the harbour and their waiting ship. The finery of the evening before had been put aside, and they had all resumed their customary clothes. Even King Fulrak and the Earl of Selene, had donned plain garb, and now resembled nothing quite so much as two moderately prosperous Sendars on a business trip. Queen Layla, who was not to go with them, rode beside her husband, talking earnestly to him with an expression on her face that seemed almost to hover on the verge of tears. The party was accompanied by soldiers, cloaked against the raw, chill wind off the sea. At the foot of the street which led down from the palace to the harbour, the stone wharves of Sendar jutted out into the choppy water, and there, rocking and straining against the hawsers which held her, was their ship. She was a lean vessel, narrow of beam and high-prowed, with a kind of wolfish appearance that did little to quiet Garion's nervousness about his first sea voyage. Lounging about on her deck were a number of savage-looking sailors, bearded and garbed in shaggy garments made of fur. With the exception of Barak, these were the first Chereks Garion had ever seen, and his first impression was that they would probably prove to be totally unreliable. "Barak!" a burly man halfway up the mast shouted, and dropped hand over hand down a steeply slanting rope to the deck, and then jumped across to the wharf. "Reldick!" Barak roared in response, swung down from his horse, and clasped the evil-looking sailor in a bear hug. "It would seem that Lord Barak is acquainted with our captain," the Earl of Selene observed. That's disquieting, Silk said wryly. I was hoping for a sober, sensible captain of middle years and a conservative disposition. I'm not fond of ships and sea travel to begin with. I'm told that Captain Greldick is one of the finest seamen in all of Cherek, the Earl assured him. My lord, Silk said with a pained look, Cherek definitions can be deceptive. Sourly, he watched Barak and Greldick toasting their reunion with tankards of ale that had been passed down to them from the ship by a grinning sailor. Isn't this supposed to be early morning? I'm not entirely certain the sun has quite risen yet. Queen Layla had dismounted, and she embraced Aunt Pole. Please watch out for my poor husband, Pole, she said with a little laugh that quivered a bit. Don't let those Alorn bullies goad him into doing anything foolish. Of course, Layla, Aunt Pole said comfortingly. Now, Layla, King Fulrak said in an embarrassed voice, I'll be all right. I'm a grown man, after all. The plump little queen wiped her eyes. I want you to promise to wear warm clothes, she said, and not to sit up all night drinking with Anheg. We're on serious business, Layla, the king said. There won't be time for any of that. I know Anheg too well, the queen sniffed. She turned to Mr. Wolf, stood on her tiptoes and kissed his bearded cheek. Dear Belgarath, she said, when this is over, promise that you and Pole will come back for a long visit. I promise, Layla, Mr. Wolf said gravely. Marmo says, the king and queen of Sendar are so cute. The tide's turning, Lord King, Greldick said, and my ship's growing restless. Oh dear, the queen said. She put her arms around the king's neck and buried her face in his shoulder. Now, Fulrak said awkwardly. Hey. Ooh. Ben's got to have his midstream bark, apparently. Farmo says Ben didn't like my captain voice. Maybe that's it. If you don't go now, I'm going to cry right here in public, she said, pushing him away. The stones of the wharf were slippery, and the slim Cherek ship bobbed and rolled in the chop. Sharky say, Mrs. Queen Layla. Oh, Mrs. Sharky is saying Queen Layla is very Mrs. Claus-like. I was like, Mrs. Queen Layla. I just don't think I've seen too many renditions of Mrs. Claus that have much dialogue, really. I've seen images of, Mrs. Claus, whatever, but I don't know if I have much of a personality association for a Mrs. Claus. The narrow plank they had to cross heaved and swayed dangerously, but they all managed to board without accident. The sailors slipped the hawsers and took their places at the oars. The lean vessel leaped away from the wharf and moved swiftly into the harbor past the stout and bulky merchantmen anchored nearby. Queen Layla stood forlornly on the wharf, surrounded by tall soldiers. She waved a few times, and then stood watching, her chin lifted bravely. Captain Greldick took his place at the tiller, with Barak by his side, and signaled to a squat, muscular warrior crouched nearby. The squat man nodded, and pulled a ragged square of sailcloth off a hide-topped drum. He began a slow beat, and the oarsmen immediately took up the rhythm. The ship surged ahead and made for the open sea. Once they were beyond the protection of the harbor, the swells grew so ponderous that the ship no longer rocked, but ran instead down the back of each wave and up the face of the next. The long oars, dipping to the rhythm of the sullen drum, left little swirls on the surface of the waves. The sea was lead-gray beneath the wintry sky, and the low, snow-covered coastline of Sandaria slid by on their right, bleak and desolate-looking. Garion spent most of the day shivering in a sheltered spot near the high prow, moodily staring out at the sea. The shards and shambles into which his life had fallen the night before lay in ruins about him. Wow, Garion. I guess he can't hold it against him too much. He has had some shocking revelations. The idea that Wolf was Belgarath and Aunt Pol was Polgara was, of course, an absurdity. He was convinced, however, that a part of the whole thing, at least, was true. She might not be Polgara, but she was almost certainly not his aunt. He avoided looking at her as much as possible, and did not speak to anyone. Mr. Sharkey is picturing the boat picking up its skirt, 30s cartoon style, and running up the waves. Wow. That's quite the image. Farmo says the sea is good for staring moodily at. Yeah, I think that's one of its primary uses. They slept that night in cramped quarters beneath the stern deck of the ship. Mr. Wolfe sat talking for a long time with King Fulrak and the Earl of Salim. Garion covertly watched the old man, whose silvery hair and short-cropped beard seemed almost to glow in the light from a swinging oil lamp hanging from one of the low beams. He still looked the same as always, and Garion finally turned over and went to sleep. The next day they rounded the Hook of Sandaria. The Hook of Sandaria. I'm wondering if that's this little bit at the bottom here. Maybe they're following this coast. The next day they rounded the Hook of Sandaria and beat northeasterly, sounds about right, with a good following wind. The sails were raised, and the oarsmen were able to rest. Garion continued to wrestle with his problem. On the third day out, the weather turned stormy and bitterly cold. The rigging crackled with ice, and sleet hissed into the sea around them. Hiss! Get it?
If this doesn't break, it'll be a rough passage through the bore,
Barak said, frowning into the sleet. Come on, Barak. Where's the bore? Oh, you know what? No, I am mistaken. I'm mistaken about where they were. They're not inside the Gulf of Cherek. They're outside the Gulf of Cherek. They are coming from out here, because Sendar was on this coast down here. So they're coming up towards the Cherek Bore, which is on this map. So they're currently sort of in the Sea of Winds, I believe, way on this side here. And they're coming up towards this little gap here where it says the Cherek Bore. I don't know if you can make that out. So they're south of the map on this side. I thought maybe that was later, the bore, but nope. It's now. Well, not now, but soon. let me go back to that. All right, let's see.
If this doesn't break, it'll be a rough passage through the bore,
Barak said, frowning into the sleet. Rude. The what? Dernick asked apprehensively. Dernick was not at all comfortable on the ship. He was just recovering from a bout of seasickness, and he was obviously a bit edgy.
The Cherek Bore,
Barak explained.
It's a passage about a league wide between the northern tip of Sandaria and the southern end of the Cherek Peninsula. Riptides, whirlpools, that sort of thing. Don't be alarmed, Dernick. This is a good ship, and Greldick knows the secret of navigating the bore. It may be a bit rough, but we'll be perfectly safe. Unless we're unlucky, of course.
That's a cheery thing to say, Silk observed dryly from nearby. Sharky say, I hate it when people frown into me. And Farmos doesn't like motion sickness. That's a cheery thing to say, Silk observed dryly from nearby. I've been trying for 3 days not to think about the bore. Is it really that bad? Dernick asked in a sinking voice. I make a special point of not going through it sober, Silk told him. Barak laughed.
You ought to be thankful for the bore, Silk, he said. It keeps the Empire out of the Gulf of Cherek. All Drasnia would be a Tolnedran province if it wasn't there.
I admire it politically, Silk said, but personally I'd be much happier if I never had to look at it again. I admire it politically. On the following day, they anchored near the rocky coast of northern Sandaria and waited for the tide to turn. In time, it slackened and reversed, and the waters of the Sea of the Winds mounted and plunged through the bore to raise the level of the Gulf of Cherek.
Find something solid to hold on to, Garion,
Barak advised as Greldick ordered the anchor raised.
With this following wind, the passage could be interesting.
He strode along the narrow deck, his teeth gleaming in a broad grin. It was foolish. Garion knew that, even as he stood up and began to follow the red-bearded man toward the prow. But 4 days of solitary brooding over a problem that refused to yield to any kind of logic made him feel almost belligerently reckless. He set his teeth together and took hold of a rusted iron ring embedded in the prow. Barak laughed and clapped him a stunning blow on the shoulder.
Good boy, he said approvingly. We'll stand together and look the bore right down the throat.
Garion decided not to answer that. With wind and tide behind her, Greldick's ship literally flew through the passage. Literally? Yawing and shuddering as she was seized by the violent riptides. Icy spray stung their faces, and Garion, half blinded by it, did not see the enormous whirlpool in the center of the bore until they were almost upon it. He seemed to hear a vast roar and cleared his eyes just in time to see it yawning in front of him. "What's that?" he yelled over the noise.
"The great maelstrom!"
Barak shouted.
"Hold on!"
The maelstrom was fully as large as the village of Upper Gralt, and descended horribly into a seething, mist-filled pit unimaginably far below. Incredibly, instead of guiding his vessel away from the vortex, Greldick steered directly at it. "What's he doing?" Garion screamed.
"It's the secret of passing through the bore,"
Barak roared.
"We circle the maelstrom twice to gain more speed. If the ship doesn't break up, she comes out like a rock from a sling, and we pass through the riptides beyond the maelstrom before they can slow us down and drag us back."
"If the ship doesn't what?"
"Sometimes a ship is torn apart in the maelstrom,"
Barak said.
"Don't worry, boy. It doesn't happen very often, and Greldick's ship seems stout enough."
The ship's prow dipped hideously into the outer edges of the maelstrom, and then raced twice around the huge whirlpool, with the oarsmen frantically bending their backs to the frenzied beat of the drum. The wind tore at Garion's face, and he clung to his iron ring, keeping his eyes averted from the seething maw gaping below. And then they broke free and shot like a whistling stone through the churning water beyond the maelstrom. The wind of their passage howled in the rigging, and Garion felt half suffocated by its force. Gradually, the ship slowed in the swirling eddies, but the speed they had gained from the maelstrom carried them on to calm water in a partially sheltered cove on the Sendarian side. Barak was laughing gleefully and mopping spray from his beard.
"Well, lad," he said, "what do you think of the bore?"
Garion didn't trust himself to answer, and concentrated on trying to pry his numb fingers from the iron ring. A familiar voice rang out from the stern. "Garion!" "Now you've gone and got me in trouble," Garion said resentfully, ignoring the fact that standing in the prow had been his own idea. Aunt Pole spoke scathingly to Barak about his irresponsibility, and then turned her attention to Garion. "Well," she said, "I'm waiting. Would you like to explain?" "It wasn't Barak's fault," Garion said. "It was my own idea." There was no point in their both being in trouble, after all. "I see," she said. "And what was behind that?" The confusion and doubt which had been troubling him made him reckless. "I felt like it," he said, half defiantly. For the first time in his life, he felt on the verge of open rebellion. "You what?" "I felt like it," he repeated. "What difference does it make why I did it? You're going to punish me anyway." Aunt Pole stiffened. Her eyes blazed. Mr. Wolf, who was sitting nearby, chuckled. "What's so funny?" she snapped.
"Why don't you let me handle this, Pole?"
the old man suggested. "I can deal with it," she said.
"But not well, Pole," he said. "Not well at all. Your temper's too quick, and your tongue's too sharp. He's not a child anymore. He's not a man yet, but he's not a child either. The problem needs to be dealt with in a special way. I'll take care of it." He stood up. "I think I insist, Pole." "You what?" "I insist." His eyes hardened. "Very well," she said in an icy voice, turned, and walked away. "Sit down, Garion," the old man said. "Why is she so mean?" Garion blurted. "She isn't," Mr. Wolf said. She's angry because you frightened her. Nobody likes to be frightened.
I'm sorry, Garion mumbled, ashamed of himself.
Don't apologize to me, Wolf said. I wasn't frightened.
He looked for a moment at Garion, his eyes penetrating.
What's the problem? He asked.
They call you Belgarath, Garion said, as if that explained it all. And they call her Polgara.
So?
It's just not possible.
Didn't we have this conversation before? A long time ago?
Are you Belgarath? Garion demanded bluntly.
Some people call me that. What difference does it make?
I'm sorry, Garion said. I just don't believe it.
All right,
Wolf shrugged.
You don't have to if you don't want to. What's that got to do with your being impolite to your aunt?
It's just... Garion faltered. Well... Desperately, he wanted to ask Mr. Wolf that ultimate, fatal question. But despite his certainty that there was no kinship between himself and Aunt Pole, he could not bear the thought of having it finally and irrevocably confirmed.
You're confused, Wolf said. Is that it? Nothing seems to be like it ought to be, and you're angry with your aunt because it seems like it has to be her fault.
You make it sound awfully childish, Garion said, flushing slightly.
Isn't it?
Garion flushed even more.
It's your own problem, Garion, Mr. Wolf said. Do you really think it's proper to make others unhappy because of it?
No, Garion admitted in a scarcely audible voice. A conspiracy of historians.
Your aunt and I are who we are, Wolf said quietly. People have made up a lot of nonsense about us, but that doesn't really matter. There are things that have to be done, and we're the ones who have to do them. That's what matters. Don't make things more difficult for your aunt just because the world isn't exactly to your liking. That's not only childish, it's ill-mannered, and you're a better boy than that. Now, I really think you owe her an apology, don't you?
I suppose so, Garion said.
I'm glad we had this chance to talk, the old man said. But I wouldn't wait too long before making up with her. You wouldn't believe how long she can stay angry.
He grinned suddenly.
She's been angry with me for as long as I can remember, and that's so long I don't even like to think about it.
I'll do it right now, Garion said.
Good,
Wolf approved. Garion stood up and walked purposefully to where Aunt Pole stood staring out at the swirling currents of the Cherek Bore. Aunt Pole, he said. Yes, dear? I'm sorry. I was wrong. She turned and looked at him gravely. Yes, she said, you were. I won't do it again. She laughed then, a low, warm laugh, and ran her fingers through his tangled hair. Don't make promises you can't keep, dear, she said, and she embraced him, and everything was all right again. After the fury of the tide through the Cherek Bore had abated, they sailed north along the snow-muffled east coast of the Cherek Peninsula toward the ancient city which was the ancestral home of all Alorns, Algar and Drasnian, as well as Cherek and Revan. The wind was chill and the skies threatening, but the remainder of the voyage was uneventful. After 3 more days, their ship entered the harbor at Val Alorn and tied up at one of the ice-shrouded wharves. Val Alorn was unlike any Sendarian city. Its walls and buildings were so incredibly ancient that they seemed more like natural rock formations than the construction of human hands. The narrow, crooked streets were clogged with snow, and the mountains behind the city loomed high and white against the dark sky. Several horse-drawn sleighs awaited them at the wharf, with savage-looking drivers and shaggy horses stamping impatiently in the packed snow. There were fur robes in the sleighs, and Garion drew one of them about him as he waited for Barak to conclude his farewells to Greldick and the sailors.
"Let's go,"
Barak told the driver as he climbed into the sleigh.
"See if you can't catch up with the others."
"If you hadn't talked so long, they wouldn't be so far ahead, Lord Barak," the driver said sourly.
"That's probably true,"
Barak agreed. The driver grunted, touched his horses with his whip, and the sleigh started up the street where the others had already disappeared. Fur-clad Cherek warriors swaggered up and down the narrow streets, and many of them bellowed greetings to Barak as the sleigh passed. At one corner their driver was forced to halt while two burly men, stripped to the waist in the biting cold, wrestled savagely in the snow in the center of the street to the encouraging shouts of a crowd of onlookers.
"A common pastime,"
Barak told Garion.
"Winter's a tedious time in Val Alorn."
"Is that the palace ahead?" Garion asked. Barak shook his head.
"The Temple of Belar,"
he said.
"Some men say that the bear god resides there in spirit. I've never seen him myself, though, so I can't say for sure."
Then the wrestlers rolled out of the way, and they continued. On the steps of the temple, an ancient woman, wrapped in ragged woolen robes, stood with a long staff clutched in one bony hand, and her stringy hair wild about her face. "Hail, Lord Barak!" she called in a cracked voice as they passed. "Thy doom still awaits thee!" Farmo says, "Road hazard ahead, wrestling half-naked man."
"Stop the sleigh!"
Barak growled at the driver, and he threw off his fur robe and jumped to the ground.
"Martje!"
He thundered at the old woman.
"You've been forbidden to load her here. If I tell Anheg that you've disobeyed him, he'll have the priests of the temple burn you for a witch."
The old woman cackled at him. And Garion noted with a shudder that her eyes were milk-white blankness. "The fire will not touch old Martje," she laughed shrilly. "That is not the doom which awaits her."
"Enough of dooms,"
Barak said.
"Get away from the temple."
"Martje sees what she sees," the old woman says. I'm possibly pronouncing her name wrong. It's spelled Martje. So I'm just saying Martje, but maybe there's a different pronunciation for those letters. Any guesses? "Martje sees what she sees," the old woman said. "The mark of thy doom is still upon thee, great Lord Barak." "When it comes to thee, thou shalt remember the words of old Martje." And then she seemed to look at the sleigh where Garion sat, though her milky eyes were obviously blind. Martje? I can switch it to Martje. Old Martje sees what she sees. Her expression suddenly changed from malicious glee to one strangely awestruck. "Hail, greatest of lords," she crooned, bowing deeply. "When thou comest into thine inheritance, Remember that it was Old Martje who first greeted thee. Barak started toward her with a roar, but she scurried away, her staff tapping on the stone steps. What did she mean? Garion asked when Barak returned to the sleigh.
She's a crazy woman,
Barak replied, his face pale with anger.
She's always lurking about the temple, begging and frightening gullible housewives with her gibberish. If Anheg had any sense, he'd have had her driven out of the city or burned years ago.
He climbed back into the sleigh.
Let's go,
he growled at the driver. Garion looked back over his shoulder as they sped away, but the old blind woman was nowhere in sight. And it is 8 o'clock on the dot. That's the end of chapter 12. Page 171. It was only 10 pages long. Let's take a look at the next chapter. Looks like another 10 pages. It goes to page 181. So that took, I think, about half an hour-ish for 10 pages. What do people think? Should I keep going, or do we want to call it there for this Friday evening? Because I could read another chapter. We could get through chapter 13, or we could stop here. Either way is fine with me. The next one is The Palace of King Anheg. Farmhouse isn't feeling too good, and the Sharkies are fine either way, so why don't we stop there then? We've got one against continuing and one abstain, so yeah, I think that's a good place to stop. But we have entered Cherek, and already I feel like it's pretty different than Sendar had been. There were dangers in Sendar, but your average person, I think, your average Sendarian, you had a lot of farmers, a lot of farmland, and then in the cities and towns, you had people who took themselves seriously, but you wouldn't necessarily consider them dangerous. But we get to Cherek, we get to Val Alorn, and we've got Cherek warriors swaggering through the streets, and big burly men wrestling in the streets, and crazy old witches yelling prophecies on the steps of temples. So so far I think there's a pretty drastic difference between Sandaria and Cherek. And Garion's had a little bit of a talk with Mr. Wolf and Aunt Pole, so hopefully he's not feeling quite so moody. Things are definitely not back to normal, though. And his first sea ride, his first journey across the water, I guess second journey across the water, because he did have the adventure on the raft, but that was just a pond. But yes, his first sea voyage. Voyage, that's the word. Through the Cherek Bore, standing at the prow of the ship, while Barak just laughs the whole way. Oh, boy. Well, we are officially in part 2. Part 1 was slightly more than half the book, so we're getting closer and closer towards the end. Alright, well, I think I'm going to get some kind of dinner. Maybe just some leftovers or something for dinner, we'll see. And anyone got any big plans for this weekend? I don't think I've got any significant plans. Might see some people on Sunday, but we might not. We might possibly either play some D&D, which it's been a while. I haven't played D&D at all this year. It's not much happening time of year. We might take down some Christmas lights. We might possibly watch the third Matrix movie, finish up the trilogy so that we can get around to watching the new one. Because I would like to see that while it's still in theaters. I don't think it's been very successful. I haven't looked at the numbers specifically, but I haven't seen a lot about it. Not nearly as much as I would have expected to. I think it suffered for having come out at the same time, basically, as a similar time frame as No Way Home Spider-Man. And I think that drew a lot more people in than The Matrix did. Sharky's gonna get a few things done. Yeah, we need to do a little cleaning as well. A little vacuuming, a little kitchen cleaning. Some things of that nature. Christmas lights coming down. I am a little sleepy, but we'll see whether that translates to actually getting some sleep. I don't know. Mr. Sharky has to work on some D&D for the last leg of your campaign. Are you excited to be coming towards the end of that? I don't know if I have ever actually run a game to a proper ending. I've played in only 1 or 2 games that came to proper endings. Most games that I've been in or run just tend to sort of peter out, which is disappointing, but I think fairly common as well. Yes, that dress. I saw that dress with the Matrix script, whatever, flowing down. I guess it was actually the brand in that style, but you hope it's a proper ending. If everybody's happy at the end, or satisfied at the end, I suppose, not necessarily happy, then that's a proper ending. I think that's really the only requirement. If everybody involved agrees that it's a proper ending, then it's a proper ending. All right, well, have a good evening, everyone. Have a good rest of your Friday and a good weekend. I'll be back here next Wednesday, I believe. I don't think I have anything that would be stopping that. Yeah. So I'll see you then. Oh, is Puppy coming to say goodnight as well? I hear Puppy. Ah, there's Puppy. Binny Pick. You coming to say goodnight? Look at that waggy tail. Waggy goodnight tail. Oh, big goodnight shake too. Yeah, these are all goodnight things. Alright. Bye-bye. See you next week. Wah.